What does it take to challenge an empire? In the heart of ancient Rome, one man dared to answer this question. Spartacus, gladiator, rebel, legend. His story of defiance against overwhelming odds still captivates us today. In this video, we'll uncover the truth behind the myth and explore how a Thracian slave shook the foundations of the mightiest empire on earth. By the end, you'll not only know Spartacus's incredible journey, but also discover how his legacy can inspire us in our modern lives. Are you ready to step into the arena of history and learn lessons that have endured for over 2 millennia? If you're passionate about uncovering stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on our upcoming deep dives into the past. The origins of Spartacus. Our journey begins in the rugged lands of Thrace, a region known for its fierce warriors. Imagine a young Spartacus, growing up in a world where strength and courage were prized above all else. The exact date of his birth is lost to history, but we know he lived in the 1st century BC, a time of great turmoil and expansion for the Roman Republic. Plutarch, the ancient Greek historian, tells us that Spartacus was a Thracian by birth, who had once served as a soldier with the Romans, but had since been a prisoner and sold for a gladiator. This brief description gives us crucial insights into Spartacus's background. As a Thracian, Spartacus would have been raised in a warrior culture, skilled in combat from a young age. The Thracians were renowned for their bravery and their distinctive fighting style, often wielding curved swords that struck fear into their enemies. But how did this Thracian warrior end up as a slave in Rome? Here, we must piece together a likely scenario based on historical context. Rome, in its relentless expansion, frequently came into conflict with neighboring peoples. It's possible that Spartacus, serving as an auxiliary in the Roman army, found himself on the losing side of a conflict or was betrayed by his Roman allies. Imagine the shock and humiliation Spartacus must have felt, going from a free warrior to a slave in chains. The journey from Thrace to Italy would have been grueling, with slaves treated as little more than cattle. This experience would have given Spartacus first-hand knowledge of the cruelty of the Roman slave system, planting the seeds of his future rebellion. Upon arrival in Italy, Spartacus's fate took another dramatic turn. His physical prowess and military background made him an ideal candidate for gladiatorial combat. He was sold to a lanista, or gladiator trainer, named Lentulus Batiatus, who ran a gladiatorial school in Capua. In the ludus, gladiatorial school, Spartacus would have undergone rigorous training, honing his already formidable combat skills. But more than that, he would have formed bonds with his fellow gladiators, men from various backgrounds united by their shared oppression. It was here, in the brutal confines of the ludus, that Spartacus's leadership skills began to emerge. This period of Spartacus's life is crucial for understanding his later actions. He experienced both sides of Roman society, as a soldier and as a slave. This unique perspective would prove invaluable in his future struggle against Rome. As we conclude this section on Spartacus's origins, we're left with the image of a man forged by adversity, his spirit unbroken by the chains of slavery. The stage is set for an extraordinary rebellion that would shake Rome to its core. The Roman slave system. To truly understand Spartacus's rebellion, we must first grasp the harsh realities of the Roman slave system. Imagine a society where up to 1/3 of the population lived in bondage. This was the reality of ancient Rome. Slavery was the backbone of the Roman economy. From the grandest senator's villa to the humblest farm, slaves were everywhere. They worked in the fields, toiled in the mines, served in households, and even acted as teachers and doctors. The Romans had a saying, "So many slaves, so many enemies." This reflected their constant fear of slave revolts. Let's break down the types of slaves in Roman society. Agricultural slaves. These were often considered the lowest of the low, working from dawn to dusk in the latifundia, large estates. They faced brutal conditions. Imagine being chained together while working, sleeping in underground prisons called ergastula. The life expectancy of these slaves was shockingly low. Miners. If agricultural slaves had it bad, miners had it worse. Sent deep underground in dangerous conditions, many died from cave-ins, poisonous fumes, or sheer exhaustion. The silver mines of Spain were particularly notorious. Domestic slaves. While their conditions were often better than field slaves, they were still at the mercy of their masters. Some were treated almost as family members, while others faced constant abuse. Skilled slaves. Those with special skills or education could become teachers, accountants, or artisans. While their daily lives might be more comfortable, they were still property, with no rights of their own. Gladiators. This is where Spartacus found himself. Gladiators occupied a unique position in Roman society. They were both despised as slaves and admired for their courage and skill. Their lives were constantly at risk, yet they could also gain fame and, occasionally, freedom. The treatment of slaves varied widely depending on their master and their role. Some were treated relatively well, while others faced constant cruelty. Cato the Elder, a respected Roman statesman, advised treating slaves like farm animals, working them hard, and discarding them when they became too old or sick to be useful. It's important to note that slavery in Rome wasn't based on race as in more recent history. Slaves came from all conquered territories: Gaul, Greece, Syria, Germania, and of course, Thrace. This diversity would later play a crucial role in Spartacus's rebellion. The threat of rebellion was ever present in Roman society. Before Spartacus, there had been two significant slave revolts in Sicily, known as the Servile Wars. These uprisings were brutally crushed, with thousands of slaves crucified as a warning to others. Despite these harsh realities, there were ways for slaves to gain freedom. Some were allowed to save money and eventually buy their freedom. Others were freed by their masters, becoming liberti, freedmen. However, even freed slaves faced discrimination and limitations on their rights. This was the world Spartacus found himself in, a world of oppression, cruelty, and injustice. But it was also a world ripe for change. The very system that sought to break him would instead forge him into a leader capable of challenging Rome itself. As we conclude this section, picture Spartacus in the gladiatorial school, observing the brutality around him, feeling the weight of the chains, both literal and metaphorical, that bound him and his fellow slaves. The spark of rebellion was about to ignite, and the Roman world would never be the same. The spark of rebellion. In the sweltering summer of 73 BC, the air in Capua was thick with tension. Within the walls of Lentulus Batiatus's gladiatorial school, Spartacus and his fellow gladiators were plotting. The harsh conditions, constant danger, and loss of freedom had become unbearable. Whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire among the slaves. One fateful night, Spartacus and a small group of about 70 gladiators made their move. Armed with nothing but kitchen utensils and makeshift weapons, they fought their way out of the school. The element of surprise was on their side, and they quickly overpowered the guards. As they burst out into the streets of Capua, the reality of their situation set in. They were free, but they were also fugitives in a land controlled by their oppressors. Knowing they couldn't simply melt into the population, Spartacus led his band of rebels towards Mount Vesuvius. The mountain's slopes offered shelter and a defensive position. As news of their escape spread, more slaves flocked to join them. What had started as a desperate bid for freedom was quickly turning into something much larger. The initial Roman response was tellingly inadequate. They viewed this as a mere slave rebellion, not a serious military threat. A small force of about 3,000 militia, hastily assembled under the praetor Claudius Glaber, was sent to deal with the escapees. This underestimation would prove to be a critical mistake. As Glaber's forces approached, Spartacus showcased the military acumen that would become his hallmark. He recognized that his band of former slaves and gladiators, while fierce, were no match for organized Roman troops in open battle. Instead, he devised a plan that played to their strengths. Under cover of night, Spartacus and his men used vines to rappel down the unguarded side of Mount Vesuvius. They circled around and attacked the Roman camp from behind, catching them completely off guard. The resulting victory was total. Glaber's forces were routed, and the rebels captured vital supplies and proper weapons. This victory was a turning point. Word spread quickly of how a band of slaves had outsmarted and defeated a Roman army. The ranks of the rebel army swelled as more slaves, and even some free poor, joined their cause. Spartacus was no longer just fighting for his own freedom. He had become the leader of a full-scale rebellion against Rome. The Romans, now alert to the true threat posed by Spartacus, began to take the situation more seriously. But it was too late. The spark of rebellion had ignited a fire that would soon rage across Italy. Spartacus and his growing army were on the move, and the mightiest empire in the world found itself scrambling to respond. As we leave this pivotal moment in our story, picture Spartacus standing atop Mount Vesuvius, looking out over the Italian countryside. Behind him, a motley but determined army. Before him, the might of Rome. The stage was set for a conflict that would shake the foundations of the ancient world and echo through history for millennia to come. The rise of the Gladiator army. As Spartacus and his followers descended from Mount Vesuvius, they faced a daunting challenge. How could a ragtag group of escaped slaves hope to stand against the might of Rome? The answer lay in Spartacus's exceptional leadership and strategic mind. Drawing on his background as a possible former auxiliary soldier, Spartacus began to transform his band of rebels into a formidable fighting force. He understood that to survive, they needed to become more than just escapees. They needed to become an army. The first order of business was training. Spartacus instituted a rigorous regimen, teaching basic military tactics to those who had never held a weapon. The gladiators, already skilled fighters, became the core of this new army, sharing their combat expertise with the others. Under Spartacus's guidance, former house slaves and field workers learned to fight in formation, to follow commands, and to work as a cohesive unit. As word of their victories spread, more slaves flocked to join the rebellion. Each new arrival brought challenges and opportunities. Some came with valuable skills. Blacksmiths could forge and repair weapons. Farmers knew the lay of the land, and domestic slaves brought intelligence about Roman movements gathered from overheard conversations of their masters. Spartacus faced the monumental task of unifying this diverse group. His army consisted of people from various lands: Gauls, Germans, Thracians, and more, each with their own language and customs. He needed to forge them into a single, motivated force. His charisma and fairness in leadership played a crucial role. He instituted a system of equal distribution of spoils, ensuring that every member of his army had a stake in their success. The rebel army's numbers swelled rapidly. From the initial 70 who escaped the gladiatorial school, they grew to thousands, then tens of thousands. By the end of 73 BC, historical sources suggest Spartacus commanded an army of over 70,000 men, women, and children. With this growth came logistical challenges. Feeding and equipping such a large force required constant movement and raiding. Spartacus led his army across Italy, attacking estates and towns, freeing slaves and gathering supplies. These raids served multiple purposes. They provided necessary resources, swelled their ranks with newly freed slaves, and struck fear into the heart of Roman society. Spartacus also proved adept at improvising military equipment. His forces melted down captured iron chains and shackles, symbols of their former enslavement, to forge new weapons. They crafted shields and armor from whatever materials they could find. This transformation of the tools of oppression into instruments of liberation was both practical and deeply symbolic. As the rebel army grew in size and skill, so did its ambitions. No longer content with merely escaping slavery, they began to pose a serious threat to Roman control over Italy. Towns and cities that had once seemed impregnable now fell to Spartacus's forces. The Romans, who had initially dismissed the rebellion as a minor disturbance, now found themselves facing a full-scale war on their home soil. Spartacus's military acumen shone through in battle after battle. He employed clever tactics, often relying on surprise and mobility to overcome the more numerous and better-equipped Roman forces. His army became known for its unpredictability and fierce fighting spirit. By the dawn of 72 BC, Spartacus stood at the head of a massive, battle-hardened army that had repeatedly humiliated Rome. The slave rebellion had become a full-fledged war, and Spartacus had transformed from an escaped gladiator into one of the most feared military leaders of his time. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the Roman Republic to its core. The Mount Vesuvius victory. The slopes of Mount Vesuvius, not yet known for the devastating eruption that would come over a century later, became the backdrop for one of Spartacus's most ingenious victories. This battle would cement his reputation as a brilliant tactician and strike fear into the hearts of Roman commanders. As Spartacus and his growing band of rebels made camp on the mountain's slopes, Roman forces under the command of Claudius Glaber arrived at the base. Glaber, confident in his superior numbers and training, decided on a simple strategy: block the only known path down the mountain and wait for hunger and thirst to force the rebels into surrender or a desperate attack. At first glance, Spartacus and his followers appeared trapped. The steep cliffs of Vesuvius loomed behind them, while Glaber's forces guarded the sole path of escape. Food and water were running low, and discontent began to grow among the rebels. It seemed that the fledgling rebellion might be crushed before it truly began. But Spartacus saw opportunity where others saw only obstacles. Under cover of night, he put into motion a plan so audacious that it caught the Romans completely off guard. Using the vines that grew on the slopes of Vesuvius, Spartacus and his men crafted long ropes. Then, in complete silence, they began to lower themselves down the steep cliff face that the Romans had deemed impassable. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of men, women, and children silently descending the sheer cliff in darkness, their lives hanging literally by a thread. The slightest sound could alert the Roman sentries below. Yet, driven by the promise of freedom and their trust in Spartacus's leadership, they persevered. As dawn broke, Glaber and his men found themselves in a nightmare scenario. The rebel army, which they thought safely trapped above, had somehow materialized behind them. Spartacus launched a surprise attack on the Roman rear, catching them completely unprepared. In the chaos that followed, the rebel army inflicted a crushing defeat on the Romans. This victory was more than just a military success. It was a powerful symbol. Spartacus had taken a seemingly impossible situation and turned it into a triumph through creativity and daring. The escaped slaves, armed with little more than their wits and determination, had outmaneuvered a professional Roman army. The aftermath of the battle saw Spartacus's forces armed with captured Roman weapons and equipment. More importantly, they were buoyed by a new sense of confidence. If they could defeat a Roman army here, what else might they achieve? News of the victory spread rapidly across Italy. For the slaves and dispossessed, it was a beacon of hope. For the Roman elite, it was a terrifying demonstration that this slave rebellion was unlike any they had faced before. Spartacus was proving to be not just a rebel leader, but a formidable military commander. As Spartacus and his army descended from Vesuvius, now better armed and more confident than ever, the real war was just beginning. The Romans would soon learn that underestimating this former gladiator and his army of the oppressed was a mistake they couldn't afford to repeat. Defying Rome, Battles and Strategies. In the wake of the Mount Vesuvius victory, Spartacus and his army embarked on a campaign that would shake the Roman Republic to its core. As they moved across the Italian countryside, their ranks swelled with each passing day. Slaves, hearing of Spartacus's victories, broke their chains and flocked to his banner. Poor farmers and laborers, long oppressed by the Roman elite, also joined the cause. Spartacus's military genius truly came to the fore during this period. He understood that his army, while growing in size and skill, could not match the Roman legions in a traditional pitched battle. Instead, he employed a range of guerrilla tactics that kept the Romans off balance and played to his army's strengths. Speed and unpredictability became Spartacus's hallmarks. He would strike quickly at vulnerable targets, poorly defended towns, supply convoys, or isolated military units, and then melt away before a significant Roman force could respond. This hit-and-run strategy not only kept his army supplied, but also spread fear and confusion among the Romans. One of Spartacus's most effective tactics was to split his forces into smaller, more mobile units. These groups could cover more ground, gather intelligence, and strike multiple targets simultaneously. When faced with a larger Roman army, these units could quickly reunite, presenting a formidable force. The Roman response to these tactics was sluggish and uncoordinated at first. Accustomed to fighting set-piece battles against foreign armies, they struggled to adapt to Spartacus's fluid style of warfare. Several Roman forces were sent against the rebel army, only to be defeated in detail. As Spartacus's army moved north, they faced and defeated 2 Roman consular armies in quick succession. These victories not only provided them with more weapons and supplies, but also dealt a severe blow to Roman morale. The unthinkable was happening. An army of slaves and peasants was repeatedly defeating the finest soldiers Rome could field. Perhaps the most crucial strategic decision Spartacus made during this period was not to march on Rome itself. Despite pressure from some of his followers, he recognized that besieging the heavily fortified city would likely lead to disaster. Instead, he focused on building up his forces and striking at Rome's economic base by disrupting agriculture and trade throughout Italy. This decision reveals much about Spartacus's character and foresight. He wasn't fighting for personal glory or conquest, but for freedom, for himself and his followers. His goal was not to destroy Rome, but to escape its dominion. As news of Spartacus's victories spread, panic began to grip the Roman elite. Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most powerful men, was eventually given command of the Roman response. He began to assemble a massive force to put down the rebellion once and for all. Yet even as the noose began to tighten, Spartacus continued to outmaneuver his opponents. In one famous incident, his army was trapped between 2 Roman forces. Rather than surrender, Spartacus had his men build snowmen wearing wigs made from prisoners' hair. In the pre-dawn light, the Romans mistook these for sentries and attacked the empty camp, allowing Spartacus and his army to slip away. This period of the rebellion showcases not just Spartacus's military skill, but his ability to inspire and lead. He held together a diverse army made up of people from different lands and cultures, united only by their desire for freedom. His fair leadership and strategic acumen turned this motley crew into a force that shook the foundations of the ancient world's greatest power. As we conclude this section, we see Spartacus at the height of his success. His army, now numbering in the tens of thousands, had defeated Rome's best generals and thrown the Republic into crisis. But the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The height of the rebellion. As we enter the year 71 BCE, Spartacus's rebellion reached its zenith. What had begun as a desperate escape by 70 gladiators had swollen into a vast army, estimated by some ancient sources to number as many as 120,000 strong. This remarkable growth speaks volumes about the widespread discontent within Roman society and Spartacus's magnetic leadership. Picture the scene: a massive, diverse army moving across the Italian landscape. Former house slaves marched alongside battle-hardened gladiators. Peasants who had never before left their villages now found themselves part of a movement that was shaking the foundations of the ancient world. The army was a microcosm of the Roman Empire itself, with people from Gaul, Germania, Thrace, and beyond, all united under Spartacus's banner. The impact of this rebellion on the Italian peninsula was profound. Wealthy Romans fled their country villas, fearing attack. The economy, heavily dependent on slave labor, was in turmoil. Fields lay untended as slaves abandoned their posts to join Spartacus. Trade routes were disrupted, and the threat of attack loomed over every town and city. In Rome itself, panic gripped the elite. The Senate, accustomed to dealing with external threats, now faced an enemy within their own borders. This internal threat challenged not just their military might, but the very social order upon which their society was built. The idea that slaves could successfully revolt against their masters struck at the heart of Roman identity and power structures. Spartacus, at this point, faced a crucial decision. With his massive army and string of victories, some of his followers urged him to march on Rome itself. The city, they argued, was ripe for the taking. But Spartacus understood the realities of their situation. Despite their numbers, they lacked the equipment and training for a prolonged siege. Moreover, taking Rome was never Spartacus's goal. He sought freedom, not conquest. Instead, Spartacus proposed a daring plan. He would lead the army north, cross the Alps, and allow his followers to return to their homelands. This decision reveals much about Spartacus's character and his vision for the rebellion. He wasn't seeking to establish a new empire or to destroy Rome. His aim remained what it had been from the start: to secure freedom for himself and his followers. However, this plan exposed the inherent tensions within the rebel army. Not all of Spartacus's followers shared his vision. Many, intoxicated by their victories and the plunder they had accumulated, wanted to continue raiding the wealthy lands of Italy. Others, perhaps fearing Roman reprisals if they returned home, wished to challenge Rome's power more directly. As debates raged within the rebel camp, the Romans were not idle. The Senate, finally grasping the true threat posed by Spartacus, was marshaling its full might. The stage was set for a climactic confrontation that would determine the fate of the rebellion and shape the course of Roman history. Spartacus stood at a crossroads. Behind him lay a string of improbable victories and a liberated army larger than any Rome had faced on Italian soil. Ahead lay uncertainty and the full wrath of a wounded but still mighty empire. The choices he would make in the coming days would echo through history. The tide turns. As Spartacus's rebellion reached its peak, the Roman Senate finally grasped the true magnitude of the threat. In response, they turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most ambitious men. Crassus was given extraordinary powers and resources to end the slave revolt once and for all. Crassus approached the task with a combination of brutal discipline and strategic acumen. He began by reviving the ancient practice of decimation, executing 1 in every 10 men in a unit that had fled from Spartacus's forces. This harsh measure served to instill iron discipline in his troops, making it clear that they had more to fear from their commander than from the enemy. Meanwhile, Spartacus faced growing challenges within his own ranks. The very size of his army, once a source of strength, now became a liability. Feeding and supplying such a large force required constant movement and raiding, stretching their resources thin. Winter was approaching, and the lush Italian countryside that had sustained them was becoming barren. More critically, cracks began to appear in the unity of the rebel army. The diverse group that Spartacus had welded together through charisma and success now began to fragment under the weight of conflicting goals and strategies. A significant group, led by Gallic and Germanic fighters, split from the main force, eager to engage the Romans directly against Spartacus's advice. Crassus saw his opportunity. He sent a portion of his army under his lieutenant Mummius to follow and observe Spartacus, with strict orders not to engage. Mummius, seeing a chance for glory, disobeyed and attacked, only to be badly defeated. However, this defeat worked in Crassus's favor. Spartacus's men, emboldened by their victory, became overconfident, while Crassus used the defeat to reinforce discipline in his own ranks. As Spartacus attempted to lead his army towards Sicily, intending to use the island as a base, he found his path blocked. Crassus had built a series of fortifications across the narrow toe of Italy, trapping the rebel army in the south. This strategic masterstroke caught Spartacus off guard and marked a turning point in the campaign. Desperate to break out, Spartacus led a series of assaults on Crassus's lines. Although they initially made some headway, the rebels couldn't sustain their attacks against the well-fortified Romans. For the first time, Spartacus found himself reacting to his enemy's moves rather than dictating the pace of the conflict. As food ran short and morale began to waver, Spartacus faced the hardest decision of his leadership. Should he try to hold out, hoping to find a way through Crassus's lines? Or should he risk everything on a decisive battle? The choices he would make in these crucial moments would determine not just his fate, but that of the tens of thousands who had placed their trust in him. The tide of the rebellion had turned. Spartacus, who had defied the might of Rome for years, now found himself caught between the hammer of Crassus's advancing legions and the anvil of his fortifications. The final act of this extraordinary drama was about to unfold. The final stand and legacy. The year 71 BCE dawned with Spartacus and his army trapped in southern Italy. Crassus's strategy of containment had worked, and now he began to tighten the noose. Spartacus, recognizing the desperate nature of his position, decided to gamble everything on one final decisive battle. As the two armies faced each other on the field, the contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side stood Crassus's legions, a professional fighting force backed by the full might of Rome. On the other, Spartacus's army of former slaves and rebels, a force that had achieved the impossible, but was now at the end of its strength. Before the battle, Spartacus is said to have made a dramatic gesture. He killed his war horse in front of his troops, declaring that if they won, he would have horses in plenty, and if they lost, he would no longer need one. This act underscored the gravity of their situation and Spartacus's commitment to share the fate of his followers. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest in Roman history. Spartacus led his forces in a furious assault, aiming to break through the Roman lines and escape. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, with both sides knowing that defeat meant annihilation. Spartacus, true to his reputation, fought with unmatched courage. Ancient sources describe him cutting his way through the Roman ranks, seeking to engage Crassus in personal combat. But the weight of Roman numbers and discipline began to tell. Gradually, the rebel army was pushed back, surrounded, and cut down. As his army disintegrated around him, Spartacus continued to fight. He was last seen battling against overwhelming odds, but his final fate remains a mystery. Some accounts say he fell in battle, while others suggest he may have escaped. What is certain is that the rebellion died that day. The aftermath was brutal. Crassus, determined to make an example, crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, creating a grotesque spectacle of Roman vengeance. This act of mass execution was meant to deter any future slave rebellions. Yet, even in defeat, Spartacus's impact on history was profound. His rebellion had shaken Rome to its core, exposing the vulnerabilities of a society built on slavery. It forced the Romans to confront the harsh realities of their economic system and the dangers of treating human beings as property. Spartacus's legacy lived on long after his death. He became a symbol of resistance against oppression, his name invoked by rebels and revolutionaries throughout history. From the slave rebellions in the Americas to modern-day liberation movements, Spartacus's story continues to inspire those fighting against injustice. In literature and popular culture, Spartacus has been immortalized. His life has been the subject of novels, films, and television series, each offering its own interpretation of this enigmatic figure. He has been portrayed as everything from a freedom fighter to a proto-communist revolutionary, his story adapted to fit the ideals and struggles of different eras. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Spartacus's legacy is the questions his rebellion raises. What drives people to risk everything for freedom? How does an individual stand up against systemic oppression? These questions, as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago, ensure that Spartacus's story continues to resonate. As we reflect on the life of Spartacus, we're left with the image of a man who rose from the depths of slavery to challenge the mightiest empire of his time. His journey from Thracian warrior to gladiator to rebel leader is a testament to the indomitable human spirit. Though his rebellion was ultimately defeated, the echoes of his defiance against injustice continue to reverberate through history. In the end, Spartacus reminds us that the struggle for freedom and dignity is timeless. His story challenges us to consider what we would risk in the face of oppression and what legacy we wish to leave behind. As we conclude our journey through the extraordinary life of Spartacus, let's reflect on what his story means for us today. In a world where injustice and oppression still exist, Spartacus's courage and leadership remind us of the power of standing up for what's right, even against overwhelming odds. His tactical brilliance teaches us the value of creative thinking and adaptability in the face of challenges. What battles are you fighting in your own life? How can you channel the spirit of Spartacus to overcome obstacles and inspire others? Remember, every great change begins with a single act of defiance. If you've found inspiration in Spartacus's story, I encourage you to apply these lessons of courage, leadership, and perseverance in your own life. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How has this video changed your perspective? What other historical figures would you like to learn about? And now, a brief look at the broader context of Spartacus's world. The Roman Empire, a civilization that spanned centuries and continents, shaped the course of Western history. From its humble beginnings as a small city-state to its height as a global superpower, Rome's story is one of ambition, innovation, and often brutal conquest. If you're intrigued by the world that both created and was challenged by Spartacus, you won't want to miss our upcoming video on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, which will appear on your screen shortly. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into history and its lessons for today, please consider subscribing to our channel and supporting our work through donations. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Until our next historical adventure, remember the words often attributed to Spartacus. I am Spartacus, a reminder that we all have the power to stand up for what we believe in and inspire others to do the same.